have received some funding from CLA and from the Institute for Advanced Study to create this collaborative interdisciplinary workshop that hopefully will take place over several years and kind of transform our intellectual environment. But the project is called Memory, Trauma, and Human Rights at the Crossroads of Art and Science. And we have brought together, now it's like almost 25 faculty members and people who work on issues of memory and trauma in different institutes in Latin America and Spain. And the faculty members come from 3 of the colleges in the university: the College of Education and Human Development, the Medical School, and the CLA. And basically we want to establish a dialogue amongst us, the team, and for any interested graduate students and the public at these public lectures on the different approaches to how memory and trauma work from different disciplines. And we hope to learn from each other and kind of question the assumptions that we may bring from within our different disciplines to our understanding of trauma. I wanted to mention that there'll be 2 more of these kind of public lectures. And after the public lectures, then we, the team and the interested graduate students, have like a workshop where we continue to discuss the material from the lecture. But there are 2 more public lectures throughout this semester. There'll be several next semester. So just for people to be kind of aware of what they will be. On Monday, November 5th, we are bringing in Kathy Carruth, the Frank H. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters from Cornell University, who is one of the foremost scholars of trauma studies within kind of literary and cultural studies. And on Friday, December 7th, we'll have the public lecture by Adrian Johnson, Professor of Philosophy at the University of New Mexico, who has published together with the French philosopher Catherine Malabou on the philosophical discourse on memory, trying to integrate insights from neuroscience into philosophy. So our invited guests already are engaging in the kind of interdisciplinary explorations of memory and trauma that we hope to engage in our project. Today we have the pleasure of having our first public lecture by Professor Brian Engdahl. Brian is a clinical investigator at the Brain Sciences Center in Minneapolis, in the Minneapolis Veterans Affairs Healthcare System. He holds the William L. Anderson Chair in PTSD Research and is an adjunct professor in neuroscience, psychology, and cognitive sciences at the University of Minnesota. He has been a leading researcher in PTSD since the 1980s, with a particular emphasis on former prisoners of war. He has treated veterans since 1979. He has mentored scores of students, including more than 20 U of M PhD students, so he's quite a history. His frequent presentations and media appearances are aimed at raising society's awareness of PTSD. He has led an assisted research program supported by roughly $10 million from federal agencies and foundations. That is like a dream in our field.
Not all in one
So you're just showing off.
Yeah, not all in 1 year.
His neuroimaging and genetic research is aimed at increasing the understanding of the causes and improving the treatment of PTSD. He and his group are also focused on finding the causes and cures for Gulf War illness. His collaborations also focus on Holocaust offspring, torture victims, immigrants, and the role of spirituality in recovery from traumatization. He combines a clinician's perspective with scholarly investigation into trauma and its multi-generational transmission. So we're very excited with this talk. And today, Brian's presentation is entitled 40 Years of PTSD, the Brain Science Center's Drive to Discover Its Causes.
Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? I presume you can. Let's see, so I'll just be getting returned here. As we work together to come up with ideas to cross disciplinary boundaries and find that common ground, I was reminded of a tradition in which I was trained over in Elliott Hall. By the way, I'm a CLA graduate, okay, and a PhD from Elliott Hall. So my wife tells me I never had the sense to leave Minnesota, but here I am. Our tradition is one of individual differences, and that may be a strange term to you folks, but let me describe it as, you want me here, don't you?
Yes.
Okay.
I can follow you.
I wander around a lot. Okay. Think about it as a pyramid, okay? The base of the pyramid is what unites us all as human beings on this earth. We share it in common. The middle portion of the pyramid are individual differences, how we vary in terms of how anxious we are, or just our personalities and so on. And at the very peak are the differences that set us apart from everyone else, what makes us unique as an individual. I see everyone but me as operating at the level of the entire pyramid. What I'm going to talk to you about today is pretty much the middle of that pyramid, the individual differences, the ways in which trauma can affect some people and produce a symptom picture that requires the individual to struggle with that, to perhaps give treatment and so on. So forgive me for being a little narrow in my focus, but that's where I come from. I come from a clinical setting where we take care of people who are having lots of trouble, and it's in that middle ground. I have no financial relationships to disclose, nor will I be discussing off-label use of medications. Okay, well, that's just what I have in the files there. We always use it. The 40 years of PTSD is kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that PTSD came back into the official nomenclature in 1980. More detail on that later. In reality, it's been with us, I think, all along. Certainly the earliest written records come to us from the Sumerians. They're the earliest written records found so far. And these are, can you help me with the pronunciation? Cuneiforms, the scratches on the rock, okay? These have been translated, and they refer to a time when things were going very badly in Sumeria. Of course, the 4,000-year interval there is pretty well established by what these archaeologists have retrieved. We can certainly look to the written literature from Homer, Shakespeare, the accounts of individual survivors, and see that it is clearly portrayed. What follows in the last 4 or 5 lines there are quotes from these translations from Sumeria. And it may be a little small, so I'm going to have to revise this presentation with less text and larger typeset, so my apologies. But can you make that out a bit? I mean, those are descriptive statements. Last one reads, quote, "The storm's cyclone-like destruction, verily its terror filled me full," referring to especially being unable to sleep. The last point on the slide refers to an article that we wrote in 1988, which looks at PTSD through an evolutionary lens. We make the case there that perhaps we're wired to develop fear and anxiety and vigilance. If you think about the environment of evolutionary adaptedness in which humans evolved, it would be to your Darwinian advantage, at least, to survive possible attacks by the saber-toothed tiger, and for your memory system to take that in and never let you forget that you almost got killed when you walked around the corner in that valley. And it might even come to you in the form of nightmares. You might be permanently more anxious and less able to sleep, but Mother Nature doesn't care if you're miserable. Mother Nature wants you to have babies, okay? And there would be an evolutionary advantage to develop PTSD if you went through life-threatening experiences. So that was a point we made back then. Others have since picked it up and called it their own, but such is life. Over the last 350 years, we can go back to Swiss troops. 1678 developed something, a notion that was carried forward. It was called nostalgia. That doesn't mean just yearning for home, although that's part of the picture. These were soldiers who were traumatized to the point that they became combat ineffective, to use a more modern term. They would curl up in a ball. They would be anxious. They couldn't sleep. They wouldn't eat. They were impossible to motivate to get up and go. Napoleon's troops definitely were described as experiencing that, especially on the winter campaign in Russia. The Russians, as they pursued the Germans into Germany in, when was that, 1737, thereabouts? Yeah, they all used nostalgia, and radical methods of intervention were tried. Shame them, fit them with leeches, bury them alive as examples to other soldiers that you shouldn't allow yourself to slip into this state. Espartaroto is, I think, 18th century Spanish physicians' use of the terminology, to be broken, to be ripped. Soldier's heart came straight out of the American Civil War, where it was observed that quite a few soldiers developed permanent hyperarousal. Just with the slightest exertion, they would have tachycardia. Their hearts would beat like crazy. And they couldn't sleep, and they were nervous and jumpy all the time. The physician identified with it was a fellow named Da Costa, so it took on the name Da Costa syndrome. In the cases of those who were combat wounded, as well as having PTSD, morphine was often a treatment of choice, which was very much dead end because a large number of Civil War veterans developed pretty serious morphine addiction, also to manage their stress. Compensation sickness, railway spine, was written about by Charles Dickens. 5 years before his death, he was in a train where the first 10 cars took a plunge off the bridge, and he was witness to this riding in a rear car. And from that point on, you can follow his record. He wasn't very productive. In fact, he passed 5 years later. But he wrote about seeing images of this horrible accident. There were a lot of horrible train accidents in England that led to these terms of compensation neurosis. People would sue after being in a train crash, and they would describe all kinds of psychological symptoms. They would tie it to injuries to their spine suffered in the train crash itself. But a careful reading of those records suggests that it was largely PTSD. Freud didn't have a lot of time for PTSD. I'll touch on that again in a few slides here. He posited something called the stimulus barrier. Yes, that in healthy individuals would not be breached by traumatic experiences. And if for some reason that stimulus barrier were breached, the individual would be viewed as developing neurasthenia, which is a nervous exhaustion, a fatigue, a weakness, a generalized condition that doesn't pass, neuroticism or hysteria. Terms that came into vogue World War I were shell shock. I could do a whole lecture on that. Lack of moral fiber, leading in some cases to executions by firing squad for desertion. Battle fatigue. Through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, arose a number of advocacy groups who put forth terms that later were brought together in the diagnosis of PTSD, but rape trauma syndrome, concentration camp syndrome, many others. Each survivor group had their own advocacy wing, if you will, and they had their own term for what their people were experiencing. Step in the American Psychiatric Association. They have something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the Bible of diagnosis and, not coincidentally, insurance reimbursement. In 1952, it was decided that Freudianism was kind of passé. There were psychiatrists who were attempting to classify psychiatric illness, and DSM-1 appeared in 1952. It had a diagnosis in it that was overlapping a bit with PTSD. It was called gross stress reaction. That could result from any kind of stress you would experience as an adult that created anxiety. However, if you did not recover from your stress in 6 months' time, then another diagnosis had to be used. Neuroticism, neurotic would be applied typically. DSM-2, 1968, adult stress reaction pretty much fell off the books. They came up with adjustment reaction to adult life. In it, if you look at this little book, DSM-2, it mentions combat as a potential source of this stress reaction, or this adjustment reaction. It also mentions unwanted pregnancy, and I wouldn't put those two necessarily on the same plane, but it was sort of a catch-all diagnosis. And that was not a very satisfactory state of affair for people who experienced what we now call PTSD. There was a remarkable run-up to DSM-3, 1980. It started in about 1970. There were some very radical psychiatrists who were listening to the returning Vietnam combat vets, the Raptor movement. Entire dissertations and books have been written about this because it's an interesting social, one manifestation of the social protest movement of the times. Policy, a little bit of science, a lot of advocacy that came together in the run-up to the final version of DSM-3. The woman who oversaw it all is someone we owe a great deal to. She's a psychiatrist down, maybe semi-retired now, University of Iowa, Nancy Andreasen. And she was the chair of the Stress Reaction Committee. The powers that be in APA said, Nancy, you take care of it. Well, she knew it was real, because when she did her residency, one of her rotations was on a burn ward, okay? And she knew PTSD really happened, and people are very badly affected by traumatic events. Many of them would be affected for a very long time. She brought together the Vietnam vets, the Holocaust survivor advocacy people, the rape trauma syndrome people, and they came up with what at first I thought was kind of a horse designed by a committee. You know what they call a horse designed by a committee? It's a camel, okay? So this DSM-3 PTSD was sort of cobbled together and began to be used. This is right at the time I left graduate school and started work at the VA. So we had this new way of assessing, talking about combat veterans and their problems. DSM-4 came out in '94, DSM-5, 2013. Both of them added a few symptoms. DSM-5, quite a few actually. They jiggled around the categories. There's not strict comparability across the different versions. And, hi, Ellen. The opposite tack was taken by our European brethren in what's called the International Classification of Diseases, ICD. It's come out in multiple versions. ICD-10 is now out, and they stripped PTSD down. I think it's about 7 or 8 symptoms, not 20 or 22, and they're categorized in different ways. So maybe that has most relevance for people who, like me, who do research, because there won't be that comparability anymore. My concern is that it may also have effects on who gets approved for treatment and who gets reimbursed, because under different systems you may or may not get the diagnosis. We'll see. It's early. PTSD. What is PTSD? Unfortunately, they concatenated, they gemished 2 terms, stress and trauma. And here I'm borrowing from someone we hope to get in our lecture series, Bessel van der Kolk. One of these days, he's coming our way. I know he is. He's based in Boston. He's really one of the founders of the diagnostic category, the society that supports it, and just knows all about it. But he makes this point. There is a literature on stress, and you think of Hans Selye, maybe some of you going back to undergrad days or something, talked about the general adaptation syndrome and so on and so on. Stress, in Bessel's way of putting it, is something that you cope with. Stress is something we all live with. Stress has no place in this diagnostic label, but somehow it got in there. Trauma, on the other hand, trauma that traumatizes you, by definition, has overwhelmed your ability to cope. So this is trauma-related disorders that we are talking about here, and we're talking about their aftermath, not stress, although I may slip that word in there occasionally. I prefer not to. The two, despite all the symptoms and combinations and books and labels, you can really think about modern Western PTSD as consisting of 2 components, all right? Permanent painful memories and sensible things that people do to avoid arousing those permanent painful memories. And over-arousal and fear, anxiety and fear. So permanent painful memories, terrible fear. And they involve 2 different brain systems that overlap and intermingle. But that is the modern Western essence of PTSD, according to Brian. Now, there are those in this room who could speak to this more effectively than I could, but there's certainly cultural variations that is widely recognized. I'm no expert on that, but expressing traumatization through the soma, through pain, through tension, through sleeplessness, and generally medical style complaints is more common in other cultures than in the United States. Also experiencing dissociation, visions, hallucinations, night terrors, seeing things that aren't there. We also see PTSD as not exclusive, typically, but people will have a lot of depression. They may attempt to cope through use of drugs or alcohol. So they are, as we say, comorbid or co-occurring. What predicts PTSD onset? Well, you might think the simple answer is exposure to trauma among people who are at risk, but 2 sets of authors took a hard look at many studies. They did something called almost a meta-analysis. So Chris Bruin and his wife and his lab partners at King's College London, one of the best researchers in PTSD, gives us the first full list, and the last 3 in the upper right in descending order. So lack of social support is a big risk factor in developing PTSD among those exposed to trauma, and so on. Life stress, trauma severity, adversity in childhood, low intelligence, you're not smart enough to take advantage of treatment or figure your way out of some of your stress symptoms, low SES, childhood abuse.
Excuse me, what is SES?
Social economic status, so being poor is a risk, definitely. Being out and out abused as a child, family psychiatric history, especially among first-degree relatives. PTSD is much more common in women for reasons I am not expert on, but it's a recognized fact, as is depression, as are many disorders. Previous trauma sets the stage for the development of PTSD when you experience future trauma. Hemingway got it wrong when he said, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Whatever doesn't kill me may set the stage for me to develop PTSD the next time I'm trauma exposed. So your own personal psychiatric history, depressed people are more likely to develop PTSD. Low education, younger folks are more vulnerable. We certainly saw that in our combat veterans and prisoners of war. And minority status, slight factor there. Ozer and his group took a little different look. They took a real focus at what a person experienced at the time of the trauma exposure. So the first thing listed there is traumatic dissociation. And that refers to something you see more often in children who have fairly primitive defense tools, if you will. They don't have a way to cope with what is immediately going on them, so they will go, being done to them or happening right there in front of them. They take themselves out of the situation. They dissociate. They have an out-of-body experience or pretend like it doesn't happen. It's not happening. I don't feel anything. So if at the time of trauma exposure you dissociate, you are much more likely to go on to develop PTSD. Again, lack of support, lack of social support is a big risk factor. If you felt that you were going to die is also a risk factor. The emotions that you actually feel at the time of the trauma, intense fear, horror, shock, as opposed to just being quite numb. Prior trauma, prior psychiatric history, and family psychiatric history. So there are a lot of factors that would explain why people exposed to the same traumatic event don't all develop PTSD. In fact, depending upon the severity of the trauma exposure, you'll hear figures quoted. Let me try to put this in a different perspective. At any one time in the United States, the population survey suggests that about 4% of men meet full criteria for PTSD. In other words, they would have the diagnosis if we went out there and interviewed all of them. And 8 or 9% of women, so it's a higher prevalence rate among women in the United States at any given time. All right then. The lifetime exposure rate to potentially traumatic events, and this includes all kinds of things, in the adult population of the United States is about 80% or more. So trauma exposure is almost a fact of life if you live long enough. And in some countries it's worse, okay, obviously, but we have the best figures for the United States. So if you got 80–85% of people who have been threatened with severe injury or even death at some point in their lives, why do only 4 to 8% of them develop PTSD? Here are some of the reasons, okay? People had good support, no history of psychiatric disorder, and so on and so on and so on. So it gets complicated. Where I started this whole ramble was, you know, what causes PTSD? And the simple answer would be trauma exposure, but there's much more that goes into it. All right. What else might cause trauma exposure? Well, I was trained as a graduate student that if you didn't get over a traumatic experience that you ran into as an adult, there was something wrong with your childhood. So you should go back and get psychoanalyzed, okay? Max, get help. Lasses, getting help, okay? All right, so as young whippersnappers, we arrived at the VA in 1980, and we had this shiny new diagnosis. We had a law passed nationwide that almost dragged out a group of veterans who never could bring themselves to advocate for themselves. Prisoners of war. Prisoners of war are the politest, non-assuming people as a group, you know, that you would ever hope to meet. They wouldn't ask for a thing. So the American Legion, Disabled American Veterans, lobbied Congress, got a law passed, mandating benefits, mandating exams, mandating treatment. So we're here, new diagnosis, a bunch of people who haven't really asked for anything, all of a sudden through the exam process being asked about their mental health. And they're telling us 40 years after World War II, they're having nightmares. And we're saying, no, that can't be, that so many of you are having nightmares. The plot thickens. This is a picture of American soldiers, World War II now. We're talking April 1942. They're very ill-equipped. They were defending the Philippine Islands against a Japanese invasion, which was launched simultaneously with the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 41. These people were equipped with World War I doughboy helmets, as you see in the photo. They had bolt-action Enfield rifles, but they did hold out for 4 or 5 months. And then, because the Japanese didn't know what to do with them, they didn't expect anyone under their code of Bushido would surrender. All of a sudden, they had all these American and Filipino prisoners. So they put them on what's called the Death March. So the Bataan Death March is what is photographed here. We interviewed these people and tested them. Hundreds and hundreds of them were more than willing to tell us about their experiences in great detail, to tell us about their current psychiatric status, what their lives have been like, and also their lifetime looking back at what my life was like after I was repatriated. So we came to know them very well. We put that all in the form of numbers, and we put that all in the form of graphs. I apologize in advance for some of the graphs, but if I didn't give you a graph, the chance you believe me would be about 5%. But if I did give you a graph, there's about 100% chance you believe me, okay? What we have here are those held by Germany or Europe, those held by Japan, Korean War, Vietnam War, okay? How many survived? Well, the Germans honored the Geneva Conventions, for crying out loud, and to the extent Allied prisoners suffered at the hands of the Germans were suffering that themselves. They didn't have any food, they didn't have any medicine, and so on. But 94% of American POWs survived imprisonment by Germans or Italians. Prisoners of war in Japan, as I suggested, were not given any respect, let alone food, clothing, shelter, medicine, nothing. It's just really, really rough. So only about 60% of them survived their imprisonment, and similarly for Americans captured by the Koreans and the Chinese in the Korean War, In fact, during the first winter, 1951 to 52, when large numbers of Americans were swept up and sent way up north in North Korea, almost to the Chinese border, over 60% died that winter. These are just Americans just dying. So brutal, brutal. Vietnam, 82%. Some indication of non-combat trauma. Death march, solitary confinement, forced labor was almost universal when held by Japan, the J, the mustard color, okay? Torture and beatings, fairly routine in the Japanese prison camps, and witnessing murder, pretty common in Japanese prison camps. Correspondingly, we have current and lifetime rates of PTSD. So disregard this, just look at lower trauma, lifetime rate, current rate, those held by Germany, Korean lifetime PTSD quite high, current quite high. In Japan, prisoners of war in Japan had the highest lifetime rate, 84%. Actually, there are none of them who were free of PTSD symptoms, which tells you something. If they were held an average of 36 to 42 months, they lost on average half of their body weight. If they survived their illnesses, they still had those residuals. If trauma is prolonged enough and severe enough, we're pretty much all going to get PTSD. And for a lot of us, we're going to have it for the rest of our lives for a very long time. So severity matters. Severity definitely matters. The flip side, something called post-traumatic growth, put together by a couple of psychologists from University of North Carolina, Charlottesville. Charlotte. Chijewski, Calhoun. They ran groups for parents who had lost infants, essentially, children, to death, okay? So it was grief support, and people would cycle in and out of those groups. People who had been there for quite a while, a year or more, began to catch our professor's attention, and they began to point to some things that were brightening up in their lives. So Chijewski Calhoun came up with something they call post-traumatic growth as a concept. Now, many others have taken it and run with it, but what it means is that not for everyone, but for quite a few people who have been through severe trauma, it changes their lives in positive ways. So we asked our prisoners of war, what did going through your experience mean to you, besides all this PTSD stuff? And they just said, well, I appreciate every day. As one fellow put it, if I wake up in the morning and there's a doorknob on my side of the bedroom door, that's a good day, because he can get up and he can go about freely. And he's not locked in, okay? They appreciate the value of their lives, they appreciate relationships, they become more compassionate for each other. They shifted their priorities around quite a bit. What used to be important no longer mattered so much. Discovering that they were stronger than they thought came up again and again, because if you speak to people, and I'm not just talking about POWs, you speak to people who have survived unbelievable trauma, and you say, or you think, my, I could never have gone through that. I would have died. I would have died. I would not have made it. Well, I know my guys would take strong exception, and they would say, don't say that, because before the war, I couldn't have imagined surviving it. I could not have imagined. And what you find out is that you're stronger than you thought you were. So, none of this, I would have never made it stuff, okay? I don't know much about PTSD treatment because it's not what I'm currently involved in. However, Research Triangle Institute group under contract to the Department of Health and Human Services just issued a meta-analysis of all treatment trials that are out there for PTSD for adults, okay? They find strong evidence for the effectiveness of cognitive behavior therapy in several forms. My go-to source for all of this, anything having to do with PTSD, is my federal cabinet department's home page for PTSD. And if you can't make it out, it's www.ptsd.va.gov. And it's for anyone, not just veterans, not just people with PTSD, it's for their family. It will answer your questions. It is very high quality and an education in itself. So if any of this treatment stuff is right over your head, just go to that website if you're curious. It will walk you through. It'll meet you where you are at. Cognitive processing therapy is coming up as promising. Cognitive therapy, straight up, the examination of faulty thinking. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing has an evidence base. Rosa, can you believe it? Okay. And for some of the people who have expressed an interest in this project, narrative exposure therapy and some of its variations fit with literature, writing about your experiences, poetry, performance. There are many, many ways in which narratives can play a role in recovery. In fact, we talk about, in very general terms, if you've been through a very traumatic experience, what is it that you find hardest to do? To talk about it, okay? You don't want to be reminded about it. You're heavily invested in avoiding reminders. You're heavily invested in just protecting yourself from triggering those memories. Quite often, too, the traumatic experience does not exist as a narrative. I mean, it is sights, it is sounds, sometimes even smells. Heaven help you if there's a smell associated with your trauma. So these are fragments or percepts, okay? And people will come into our office for the first time and try to talk about it, but there are not words to express it. The goal of many therapies for many people is to help people get their story together, to help them assemble that narrative so they can at least run it by themselves or run it by someone who's very supportive. And then it loses a lot of its negative power, okay? So narrative therapy, those of you who are interested in it, I would say read up on it, go for it. You're probably already familiar with what principles underlie it. We don't have studies that compare the effectiveness of different treatment approaches. Certainly, you don't see studies out there that compare psychotherapy to medication therapy. You'll see that people are allowed into psychotherapy studies if they're on medication, antidepressants, shall we say. But the industry is not separating it is not supporting the separation of those different treatment elements. We don't know a lot. Okay. Still waiting for Lori Davis down at Tuscaloosa VA Medical Center in Alabama ran a 3-year study of mindfulness-based stress reduction for intervention in PTSD. If you look on clinicaltrials.gov, that thing wrapped up almost 2 years ago, and we haven't seen a report. We have her pilot data from 5 years ago, but I think mindfulness, those of you who may have some familiarity, is very promising. It helps people stay grounded and in the present and focused on what matters. There are other criticisms I can make of the research business out there. People are not assigned to different treatments or placebo treatments or control groups based on their individual qualities. Just flip a coin and randomize people to these treatment branches. And researchers love structured strict treatment designs, if you will, because there you have some experimental control. You can apply the numbers and so on. Funding agencies like that too. They want to see that you've cleaned out all the messiness associated with patients as they come to us, as they bring themselves to us with all their problems. They can't be abusing drugs and alcohol. They can't be on certain medications. They can't have psychoses. They can't. Well, before you know it, you've got a sample that doesn't look like anything you see in clinic. And it's kind of the coin of the realm. Very clean, almost sterile, numbers-based research. Behind that also is the insurance industry, quite frankly. And the insurance industry would do everything possible to avoid authorizing long-term therapy for someone who is a trauma survivor, okay? Because that does not limit their liability. There are laws of the land that demand mental health parity. Mental health reimbursement and services must be on par with medical and surgical services, says the law. But how that plays out these days, at least in our country, is that patients are assigned to evidence-based treatments put together by the researchers, funded by the national foundations. And the evidence-based treatments are manualized. They are by the book to the point that people with bachelor's and master's degrees can do a pretty good job of giving the lessons. And then, of course, they're very time limited. So the insurance company can pay people who cost less than people like me. I'm not holding myself out as an example, but they can pay lesser trained people to see patients with PTSD for lesser amounts of time and tell the powers that be that there is mental health parity when in fact there's not. So enough of my little soapbox speech there, but it's not really good out there. It's not really good out there. It's hard enough to find any kind of mental health treatment, and when you find it, it may not be enough. It may not be what you need. Oh, transition time. We're going to jump here. Oh, I worked with Gail Danelli. I don't know how that happened, but she is the godmother of intergenerational transmission of trauma's effects. Okay, being Israeli and knowing that in the 40s and 50s, of course, the survivors of the Nazi Holocaust were telling their stories and beginning to be studied. In the 1960s, their kids started coming in for therapy, and it was recognized that there are intergenerational effects, okay? She wrote the book, and it remains the book. It's a 1998 edited volume. She traveled around the world and came up with 30 chapters focusing on different populations around the world where the kids of parents who had survived massive trauma themselves were affected by that trauma. So the intergenerational aspects to massive trauma exposure are very real. I can say that because our chapter is coming out in the Oxford textbook of PTSD any day now. We're still waiting to see the proofs on that, but it's out there. It's been with us all along. The number of populations where this has been documented, studied, and treated continues to grow, starting with Cambodia, going right through Rwanda and beyond. Mechanisms of transmission might seem obvious. I mean, if mom or dad have bad behaviors in their repertoire and you are their kids, you may bear the brunt of those bad behaviors. You as a kid may identify with mom and dad in their adaptational style, which I'll talk about in a moment, but if their adaptational style is anger all the time, maybe that's what you model. Families can be very dysfunctional for lots of reasons, and that may fall into into the area of neglect or abuse when you were growing up. The epigenetic mechanisms are also being investigated. You hear about these on the news a lot because one of their principal researchers, Rachel Yehuda, from the Bronx VA, pushes this and has some evidence, but not as much evidence as she might like having you to think. What would be a brief definition of epigenetics? Well, you're born with your genes, those are your genetics, okay? The way in which the genes express themselves through the course of your life is impacted by the environment, okay? So the steps in the process of protein synthesis and cell creation and so on are affected by stress, by chemicals, by you name it, many, many things. So that's where the term epigenetics is brought out. And I was on a radio call-in show, Carrie Miller in November, talking about PTSD treatment, and someone really wanted to make the point that her grandmother gave her PTSD because her grandmother had PTSD. And I said, no, your grandma does not pass down PTSD genes to you, but there's a little something to that, and it's going to require some more clarification. But there is a biological basis, kind of murky right now, but there is a biological basis. It's been shown in mice, and it's been shown to a degree in humans. If we take Yael's theory, her writings about it, I think it maps more clearly into the work of this seminar series and this attempt to integrate across the humanities, the arts, and so forth. So bear with me here. She gets really complex and all-encompassing. Okay. Identity. What is identity? Identity at its core, in the dark circle here, is biological and intrapsychic. Everything that happens within your skin. Next ring out is of identity is interpersonal, family, social, community. This is all in her books and her writings. You can PubMed her or Google her, and up it'll come. Next ring out, ethnic, cultural, religious, spiritual is part of your identity. And at the furthest ring here, we have environmental, political, national, international. So taking the broadest possible view of what identity is. She goes on to talk about how identity is affected negatively by trauma, and later on by the trauma that your parents went through. So, not a good slide. But the last slide is this set of circles here, okay? This is identity. Identity, as we move through time, is exposed to victimization, trauma, what Yael calls a rupture, okay? Something you go through just tears you apart. And you may re-enter your world to a wall of silence. She talks about the conspiracy of silence. It's a key notion, especially in talking about Holocaust survivors. There was agreement not to talk about it. You may not be greeted warmly as a survivor of terrible trauma. So further intensifying the rupture and the damage to your life is seen in the 1, 2, 3rd circle up there, the present, and then that carries on through the future. So rupture, conspiracy of silence, identity on a real meta level are how Yael talks about it. I said, you know, if your work is going to have some meaning, because I'm just a researcher, okay? I'm just a numbers guy. I said, we can't leave it like Freud left it, okay? You know, it's unmeasurable, untestable, unprovable. Let us try to find some funding, and she got some from Rockefeller out in New York. let us find some funding, let us do focus groups, let us try to identify the dimensions, the items, the questions that we could ask people about the effects that the Holocaust has had on them, or ask the kids what effects their parents have had on them. Let us go through some psychological maneuvering, let us purify the item pool, let us give these to lots of people, and then let's crunch the numbers. Okay, I'm a number cruncher. Psychologist's word for that would be, let us operationalize your theory, Yael. And it's paid off. I'll just briefly talk about some of the results, but her instruments are being now translated into a lot of different languages, a lot of different cultures. Results are pouring in, and they're being used as a basis for recognition of problem areas in kids and grandkids of massive trauma survivors. They're being used to assemble better understanding worldwide. So I'm pretty pleased with this. You can, again, look it up. We cracked down about 5 papers in the last 4 years that detail this. Or you can pay $190 for that Oxford text and read our chapter. Actually, if I get a copy of it, I'm going to make it available to the group because it was done in large part on government time, which puts it in the public domain. So at least the intergenerational chapter will be available. A model. And we did take into account family history, the nature of the Holocaust trauma, mom, dad, or both. There were sometimes, you know, Holocaust survivors tended to marry other Holocaust survivors. Family milieu, what was it like for you as the kid growing up? What were your parents' victim styles? I won't go into that, but that's kind of the heart of it, because there are different ways that the parents chose or adapted after surviving the Holocaust. And what were the effects of that style upon you, the child? Another way to think about it is across the axis of time. We have the trauma, rupture, and fixity of Holocaust itself. It becomes a part of family history. Drives the development of survival strategies, the green box up there, and develops or becomes recognizable as adaptational styles and has effects on the kids. So round and round. We actually tested that with what's called causal modeling, and it worked out pretty well. More directly, I just say we should interview those kids and see if they have anxiety or depressive disorders, depending upon their parents' adaptational styles. And it turns out that if mom and dad were pretty low-key and easygoing, the kids didn't have much to complain about. Moderate levels of anger and it's just all kinds of things are covered. And high levels, all correspondingly, drove up rates of psychopathology in the kids. Transition time. We have till 5:30?
Yeah.
Oh, they're stepping up here. Okay. Brain Sciences Center. Just a few words about us. We're focused on diseases. We're focused on diseases that affect brain function such that we can see them and understand them using genetic analysis. We're also moving toward treatment of a couple of diseases right now using our understanding. We have a very interesting longitudinal study of women's healthy brains as they age. We have hundreds of them in every year, and we're learning a lot about what predicts long-term brain health, which is an impossible thing to get funded through federal agencies. Everybody wants a disease, okay, but no, we found foundation money. Seriously, we found foundation money, though, that has enabled us to bring in these healthy women, and man, I see them coming in to get their brain scanned, and you know, grandma's 99 and she still drives, and anyway, remarkable people. So it consists of three of us pretty much at the top. Lisa James, she is the professor of healthy brain aging, women's healthy brain aging. Me, PTSD, and Apostolus, the neuroscientist, the Regents professor, the brains of the outfit. There we are, leaning on our trusty scanner, Lisa, Brian, Apostolus. And tell you a little bit about Scanner. It borrows from anti-submarine warfare technology, which it is to our advantage to be able to detect very faint magnetic signals from enemy submarines. Well, we put that technology in this with sensors that are cooled almost to absolute zero, so they become super sensitive, superconducting. And then we have people lie down in the scanner, hold their head still for a minute, and they're done. There's no magnetism, no radiation, no goo in your hair, no risk, okay? So we've had 4,000 or 5,000 people scanned in that thing. It's easy, one and done. Very high resolution in terms of time. There are 1,000 slices taken every second, and there are 248 cross-correlations, almost 30,000 cross-correlations per millisecond. So we have a supercomputer that crunches all those numbers. The essence of brain function is communication. It's cross communication all the time, rewiring constantly throughout the lifespan. And healthy brains all look the same in a resting state. That saves us, you know. All healthy families look the same, all happy families look the same. All healthy brains look the same. And if you can define a disease cleanly enough and scan a group of those people and subtract the normal healthy brain, what is left over is the brain signal that defines the disease. So disturbed communication tells the story. What's a MEG scan look like? Well, from the top down, we're looking at positive cross correlations in the green. Front of the brain is toward the top, left, right. Red are the negatives, I believe, but kind of quiet, resting state. We had someone come in who had been drinking the equivalent of a quarter to a vodka a day, so he was medically at risk of dying. He had to have a medical detoxification. And somehow we got consent to scan him over a 15-day period. This is what his brain looked like on day one, just kind of a storm of random cross-communications in a resting state. With continued abstinence from alcohol, his scan began to look better. There's day 7, there's day 15. Ultimately, with enough abstinence, he would get close to normal brain, but maybe not quite all the way back. But that's what we're checking when we do these tests. We applied this to quite a few disease groups. We mapped them out in what's called a 2-dimensional space using multidimensional scaling. And the groups are very clean. The controls are in the middle. Autoimmune disorders, MS and Sjogren's syndrome kind of are close together up in the upper left-hand corner, and so on. But it's a way that you can classify diseases or map them based on communication and miscommunication patterns. A lot of people in psychiatry are trying to neuroimage mental illness. PTSD is one of those areas. Findings are kind of inconsistent. People don't all analyze their data correctly. They use different challenges within their MRI scanners. We took it upon ourselves to identify veterans who had PTSD and nothing else. So we had a pure sample, and we ran our brain scans, and here's what PTSD looks like on a MEG scan. We're looking at the right side of the brain, back of the brain, front of the brain, and you're looking at areas A, B, C. A is actually the area that by itself can correctly classify those with PTSD from those who don't have it. It's right here, okay? Upper or superior right temporal lobe. We looked in the literature for just wild notions about what that might be about. There was a a neurosurgeon by the name of Penfield at McGill University in the 60s, 50s, 60s, who did the conscious sedation surgery on people with uncurable epilepsy. So we would open their brains and stimulate parts of their brain so as to avoid actually burning or destroying parts of the brain that were important. So, and he would ask them to report if they felt something or if they could still speak or add. Or when he stimulated this part of the brain, he would trigger incredibly real flashbacks that people would describe a scene from previously in their life. It was as if they were there, they were seeing it again, they were feeling it again, and so on. So we're just hypothesizing that that has something to do with the permanent painful memories that haven't been successfully reintegrated into normal memory pathways. In fact, we had a subgroup of veterans who previously in their lives had serious PTSD and had recovered a good deal by the time they were in our scanner. They still have this spot, some evidence of it there, and that would fit with what people tell us. You know, they will always be able to see those scenes. They will probably go to their grave remembering the horrible things they went through, but their lives are better now and they can manage it. So another fast forward. This has something to do with PTSD. Bear with me, it's a little technical, but the United States and the Coalition of the Willing came together in 1990 to rid Kuwait of Saddam Hussein. It's called Desert Storm. The United States activated 700,000 service members in a matter of 6 months in the end of 1990, sending them over in large numbers. And about 25% of them came back with unexplained medical symptoms, collectively referred to as Gulf War illness. And up till now, they haven't had a good explanation for what is wrong with them. And what is Gulf War illness? Well, it's a whole collection of unexplained symptoms, and I list some of them here. Chronic fatigue, irritable bowel, fibromyalgia, pain all over, tired all the time, can't think straight, can't remember, don't have the same emotional control that I used to, I get rashes, I get cough. If you wanted to think about one disease that is most like Gulf War illness, it's probably rheumatoid arthritis with cognitive involvement. And a lot of people who have rheumatoid arthritis are also having problems thinking, remembering, and having good emotional control. So it also sets the stage for development of PTSD. I don't have time to get into that now, but it would explain why this war that was over in 100 hours, declared a victory and a perfect war by many, why this war generated so much PTSD. We did the brain scans. Yes, it shows up on MEG scan. Left lower corner here is referring to hot spots in the cerebellum. That's at the base of your brain. Not much is known about it other than it helps serve as a motor control center. But when we gave these people who were very sick with Gulf War illness for decades, when we gave them MRIs, this is what we found. And I draw your attention to the cerebellum of a healthy person here. It looks like a big piece of broccoli. And then over here, we have the cerebellum of Gulf War illness veterans. So there's been a lot of tissue loss in the gray matter, and it ties in with their symptom levels. So it's alarming. It's really alarming. And they aren't getting healthier, they're getting sicker. Our theory is that Gulf War factors, in particular the vaccines, combined with genetic risk, left some of these people, 25% of them, vulnerable. And down through the months and years, they've had brain effects, health effects, There is a chromosome known as chromosome 6. It has on it something called the, you don't have to remember this, human leukocyte antigen complex, okay, HLA. HLA determines the lion's share of your immune response throughout your life course, okay? And its best known use these days is for matching bone marrow donors. So there's a big company, offices right down by the Viking Stadium called Be the Match, okay? And if you, as a patient, should need a bone marrow transplant, the call goes, well, you get typed, you get your HLA type, and then the call goes down to Be the Match, and they find a potential donor who matches you exactly in HLA type. We have defined 6 HLA genes that if you have the right form, you're going to be fine. If you're lacking the right form in several of those genes, or heaven forbid, all 6 of them, you have 6 risk factor HLA genes, you better live healthy because you're not going to be very resistant to things like vaccines or poor diet or you name it. So I'll probably leave it at that. But HLA type, live a good life, okay? No matter what. Don't find out your HLA type. They're always pressuring me, like this Effie back there. She wants me to get an HLA type, and it's too late for me. All right, we are putting forth this model, and it's in our papers. It will be in the PowerPoint I'll share with the group. But if you don't have enough HLA protection, you cannot fight off the challenges thrown at your immune system. You develop persistent antigens that cause disease. You didn't make it down here to health. This is health down here, where people with the right form of HLA make it. And our early work on this was recognized by Jeremy Olson, science writer for the Tribune. He worked long and hard, interviewing lots of people, including veterans themselves, and put us on the front page, Veterans Day 2016. I just added the 2 lines in red, because as Effie and Spiros and Pekka know, we have our first Gulf War vet who lacks all HLA protection. He's been sick since 1991. His plasma interferes with brain tissue operation, but medication that's FDA approved for autoimmune disorders, it's called IgG, or immunoglobulin therapy. IgG restores good function to the culture cell that Effie and Spiros and others work so hard on, but he starts Monday, and we shall see how that goes for him and others. But we also think that in these last 3 slides, we are onto something when it comes to PTSD. Apostolos, Georgiopoulos, and Lisa James have put their heads together and looked at the literature on what others think the brain mechanisms of PTSD development really are. Well, it's all part of the whole. There is the sensory input that overloads the system, that drives 2 chemicals into the stratosphere. Okay, I'll just put this in layman's terms before I puzzle you with the chemical terms here, okay? These chemicals race up and down the sensory nerve pathways and promote a great deal of activity and cell growth and what we call over-consolidation of traumatic memories. And these pathways become almost permanently burned in to your brain. They are sensory, and they are also, those are coming through the cortex, the temporal areas, the front, the top. And then they are also the fear circuitry. The fear circuitry is driven into overdrive, and these 2 chemicals get going and set the stage for persistent PTSD. Our theory is that this occurs in people who, this is more likely to occur in people who also lack some of the HLA protection factors. And we are going to be able to test this hypothesis because we have a lot of them who have allowed us to draw their blood and put it in the freezer and diagnose their PTSD and scan their brains, and we are going to just see if that theory is true. It certainly would account for much of what they experience in their lives and what their families experience and their struggles with recovery and maintenance, and shows that the biology that we are working on fits very closely with the human beings we work with in clinic, and it shows us that Descartes was wrong. Okay. There is no dualism. There is no convergence on the pineal gland. It's all part of the same cloth. Yeah, our paper, which I think will be accepted this week, talks about a two-hit model. There's a hit to the immune system, creates specific antigens. Trauma impacts your sensory system. It literally rewires your brain because to some degree you're vulnerable. You could also be vulnerable because of previous trauma, of lack of social support, any of a number of factors. I'm not putting this up as the total explanation for why PTSD develops, but we think it's part of the puzzle, and it's a new way of looking at the roots of PTSD. It can also point the way to new ways to develop treatments. So, yeah, what good is all of this? What good is all of this? Yeah, we'll move on here. Why does the Brain Sciences Center scan and draw blood and do all this computer work and try to give these talks? The first thing that came out back in 2010 when we showed the brain, your brain on PTSD, was a lot of our subjects said, it's real. I can go back home and tell my family I'm not just making it up. They always thought it was just in my head. Well, it is in my head. You can see that on the images here, but anyway, it helps destigmatize mental illness to just simply be able to see it with a brain scan. The NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness, has had me speak because for that very reason. You know, mental illness is not fake. It's not lack of willpower or weak people sort of taking refuge in fake symptoms. It's right there on brain scans. Treatment research could be sharpened up if they used our approaches to looking at treatment response through brain scans. We're about to submit a paper where we disentangle mild traumatic brain injury from PTSD in veteran patients who have both, and we can separate that out. The signal is the PTSD signal you saw previously, and mild TBI is kind of a blurring across all the sensors, so we can do what's called differential diagnosis with a simple scan. As the piece on the two-hit model suggests, we can hypothesize and support ideas about underlying pathology. We also have some very interesting results on the healthy women's brains based on scans and blood work and diet. And we definitely want to get going on all the treatment trials we can. I want to acknowledge the support of the endowed chair that I hold, William Anderson Chair in PTSD Research. I want to recognize the memory of his younger brother, Roger Anderson, now deceased radiologist, who donated lots of his money to the arts in the Twin Cities, to the Wiseman. He supported ROTC scholarships. He established a chair in simulation surgery over in neurology in the medical school so that combat medics could train on very realistic dummies. And He also funded the restoration of the Northrop Auditorium organ, which is going to be rededicated here in October. So, great guy, great guy. He, the PTSD angle was that Roger was too young to serve in World War II, but his older brother went off and served as a combat medic in Patton's army, working his way up the Italian peninsula, and he was killed. And legend has it that Roger came across his letters home to their mother, and it was clear from those letters that his brother had what we now would call PTSD. So, in memory of his brother, he endowed this chair. Thanks to all of our veterans and our big team, past and present. And thanks to all of you for listening to me. Questions? Yes?
Thank you. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on in my head. But the very first question that I had was, is there anything about the nature of the trauma itself as a predictor?
Very much so. When it is perpetrated by another human being, it's much more toxic, okay? So you don't get that impact from a hurricane or even an earthquake, but if someone is violently assaulting you physically, chances are it's very toxic. Interestingly, the most common cause of PTSD in the United States population is motor vehicle accidents, okay? You might not think it unless you've been through one yourself, where you have that memory of the whole thing coming up on you, but it creates a great deal of anxiety, sometimes full-blown PTSD. Many survivors don't return to driving. They're just not able to. Others? Yes?
Can you parse the differences between mild TBI and PTSD? I don't know what TBI is.
Oh, mild traumatic brain injury or clinically significant concussion, which is this, been described as the signature injury of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, all the IEDs and motor vehicle crashes and RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades and so on. So I worked TBI rehab for 10 years until hanging it up to going almost full-time with brain sciences, but it's a big deal. It's a really big deal. You hear about it in the NFL. You hear about it in soccer players. I mean, what is the significance? What should we be doing about it? Should we let our kids play in these sports? Yes?
You were hesitant to talk about biological transmission of trauma being multi-generational. You spoke about. Can you please just elaborate a little bit more?
It gets a little technical, but there is a quality that is imposed on the genetic products, the proteins, because, well, that's what genes do. They code for proteins that in turn create structures and repair damage in your body. The genes just sit there, but they code for these proteins. And in that transcription process, if there are, I don't know, if mom is really tense and you are in utero, or even if you're her little girl, the high cortisol levels, shall we say, or high levels of just psychic tension have an effect on the coding process. The one Rachel Yehuda talks about the most is methylation, which is a chemical term, but if you take blood from mom and you take blood from daughter, you may see similar high degrees of methylation there that you wouldn't normally expect based on just the raw genetic type, okay? So that can be passed down, some of the epigenetic process, and we're just beginning to understand that. I don't understand it very well myself, but that is the hypothesis that is out there.
Can I just ask a follow-up? So how does the HLA protection factor, you say that, you know, that's something that you're born with? I assume that that means that somehow it's genetic. Is there some intersection there as well?
I think Carrie Miller asked me, what do we do about this? And I said, well, short of gene editing, I don't really know. Live a healthy life.
No, but is that genetic then?
HLA?
Yeah.
Determined at birth, yes.
Okay.
Mhm. It's unchangeable.
At birth means genetic or something
Yeah,
that
right,
happens?
right. You are born with chromosome 6. It's
Okay.
subject to mutations along the way, very occasionally. It's pretty much something you're born with.
So-
Very complicated. Yes, sir.
So this is related to Amy's first question about PTSD perhaps being worse depending on kind of trauma someone experiences. But you don't talk about PTSD in terms of a spectrum, for example, like autism spectrum disorder, and the change, the language that's changed for talking about that issue. So, or is there a way of thinking of PTSD on the spectrum?
Very much so. In fact, we psychologists like to think in terms of dimensions, not categories. I mean, but the American Psychiatric Association is dominated by medical model people, MDs, okay, MD psychiatrists, not PhD psychologists. So one of our friends from Elliott Hall, Robert Kruger, professor, was enlisted by APA for DSM-5 to try to bring dimensions to the classification system, because that's really how it is, okay? There is a spectrum. You can have some PTSD or a lot of PTSD or severe PTSD, but the MDs talk about it as meets full criteria, over the line, or doesn't quite meet it, so subclinical. And anyway, Bob Kruger is just genius, and he has a great way of looking at this. And there's almost a floor fight at these various developmental meetings for DSM-5, and Bob and his backers lost. He's just an appendix in the DSM-5. And they stuck with the medical model. In fact, they added like 200 new diagnoses, new categories. So it's a mess, and it's pretty much driven by reimbursement. You know, you can't get reimbursed for where you are on a dimension. You have to put a code into the insurance forms to get paid. Yes?
Is that like spectrum that he was talking about, is that like within the different, because I know there are those categories like acute, chronic, sort of PTSD, so are there different spectrums within those categories, or do they encompass, like how do those operate?
I didn't want to get into acute versus chronic,
Okay.
but let's just talk about chronic, okay? You can certainly talk about a spectrum in chronic, okay? You can talk about very severe, has most or all of the symptoms to a severe degree, and they're creating a great deal of impairment, okay? You can talk about people whose PTSD is chronic but stable and moderate, and there we are starting to use terminology that resembles the spectrum, okay?
You showed us data that the MEG signal is different between PTSD patients and controls. And then you said that what some people might hypothesize that the difference between those groups is weak willpower versus strong willpower. And that's ruled out because, hey, that can't be true. It's a brain difference.
Well,
What is the brain difference?
It's the brain difference. It's the brain difference. It's no longer this lack of moral fiber, or you aren't bucking up and brushing it off.
That's what the MEG signals are reflecting.
The MEG signals reflect the true miscommunication pattern that defines the disease.
Right. Okay, but what if that's caused by, say, willpower differences, and that's what is actually being reflected by the signal? We don't know that. We can't know.
True, which is why I was clear to label the Penfield reference as still a hypothesis. Until we can go out and traumatize people after we've scanned their brains and then scan them later, we will not have, and our institutional review boards won't let us do that. We haven't asked, but Oh, no, true. I mean, there are alternative competing explanations, and you would certainly get that from the people who make the media and from time to time with their neuroimaging, and they talk about willpower and all kinds of things being reflected on brain scans. So it's sort of a wide open game, if you will. Yes?
Would it be possible to traumatize a person while you're taking the scanner?
You know, we did that. This is the early 1990s, and those of you who have to go are certainly free to go, but this would never be approved today, okay?
So then, what did you see when you...
Oh boy. We used a different technology called positron emission tomography, or PET, okay? PET, we injected radioactivity into their blood and watched how the brain took it up. And while they were being scanned, we had prepared scripts in a certain way that reflected their most traumatic event. And we read those scripts to them with a lot of active verbs, and some people literally had flashbacks in the scanner. They were there again, it was happening again, they were extremely upset, and we saw there's a deep brain structure called the amygdala that lit up. They lost all orbital frontal activity, which is the area of the brain right above your eyes. So that control dropped out. Normally that gives you emotional control. So yes, you can provoke PTSD in a scanner, but your IRB won't let you do it now.
Is it possible to do the reverse?
Possible to reverse it?
Yeah. I mean, for somebody who has PTSD, to inject something that will reduce the intensity in the amygdala.
Well, there are some who claim that certain psychiatric medications, when used with certain individuals or certain genotypes who experience reduction in symptoms, you can see that on the scanner. But that's just a small group of people. I mean, I'm rattling it off here, but people are working along those lines, I guess is what I would tell you.
Can I ask another?
Okay, just one more.
Well, it's a two-part question. Mostly, if you're aware of research that has looked at memory reconsolidation therapy as an effective way of treating trauma, and if you're aware of any studies that have looked at PTSD in perpetrators.
We don't know much about perpetrators, at least the last time I looked, and I periodically look. Rosa, any literature? No one wants to study them.
I don't look for it.
Yeah.
So there may be there, but.
I don't think so. They're just.
I know.
Novel?
Yes, literature.
Oh, man.
Dostoevsky,
Yeah.
Tolstoy.
I will out Rosa Garcia Pontonini here. She's a clinical psychologist at the Center for Victims of Torture, and we have known each other for a very long time. And if anyone would know, she would know.
So there are the famous studies of the Engdahl. But I am not aware that they did any brain, no, the technology did not exist then. But it resulted in, I will just say this, it resulted in a wonderful documentary that is called Your Neighbor's Son, which encapsulates what a torturer is like. Your neighbor's son, a common person who is then trained to be a torturer.
Light fare for a Sunday afternoon? And as to your question,
This is a psychological study using psychological measures.
usually starts with torturing them.
Well, yes, that's what would happen. There is a
Beatings.
process of desensitization. Yes, and they are well paid. That's okay, that the rest are recruits.
And you asked about memory reconsolidation therapy. I'm not knowledgeable. What we tend to do, I guess one thought we would have would be to try to unconsolidate those memories so they can be assimilated in normal memory circuitry. And they would no longer have this life of their own. They would be put in their place, to use the vernacular, to be summoned when we wish to be summoned, when we wish to summon them. So, yeah, that's a new one on me. All right. Thank you all.